According to our guest today, the war in Ukraine has lessons on waging a modern interstate war, including the use of killer robots. Let's welcome Kyle Hiebert to Boom and Bust. He is a researcher and analyst and formerly was deputy editor of Africa Conflict Monitor. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Let's lots to unpack here, Kyle, obviously. First, let's talk about Ukraine. Why is the war there unleashing new arsenals of war tools?
So Ukraine, in a lot of ways, has been a throwback to the wars of the 20th century, essentially. They've had, you have trench warfare, you have great tank battles, but at the same time, a lot of new platforms and technologies have used this as a trial period to essentially see how modern equipment, modern technologies, and artificial intelligence especially can fit within modern tactics and combat operations. And a lot of companies that have been toying with these in their labs for over the years now have a real live combat scenario to test these out. And they have been a very significant contributor to Ukraine's resilience in the face of what is seemingly overwhelming of Russian firepower, at least on paper.
Yeah, so that's part of the story, isn't it? And it goes along with the requirement to improvise in the first days and weeks of the war, right? That in order to avoid being overwhelmed by Russian forces, they had to use new technology in new ways. Is that correct?
Yeah, so some companies that have been involved have been Palantir, which is a US-based company out of Denver. They were sort of rose to fame through supplying analytics software to the US government. What they've done is create essentially a platform that uses remote sensing technologies for target acquisition. A lot of other companies as well have been just involved in essentially giving Ukraine a better information perspective, a better atmosphere for acquiring targets, monitoring enemies' movements, those sorts of things on the battlefield that just create that base of intelligence from which to launch their operations from an asymmetric level.
Interesting. So what does this mean in terms of new defense outlays for, let's say, NATO members like France, Germany, you name it?
So Ukraine has essentially kickstarted a new arms race. NATO military countries are just boosting their spending by spectacular levels going forward. France has announced a 1/3 boost through 2030. French President Emmanuel Macron has essentially said that France is being put on a wartime economy footing. Germany has broken its longstanding aversion to military spending, instead of $100 billion funds to modernize their sort of neglected military in the post-World War II period. The US has just passed their biggest defense spending bill ever in the fall, and it's brought back fears of what great interstate conflict means for countries, for allies, and this is an era of geopolitical competition and hostility that we haven't had in the post-Cold War era. And countries are, especially Western countries, are rediscovering the usefulness, the utility, and the necessity of hard power as a result.
So do you expect to see Canada following suit in that way?
I believe Canada has, this has in a way exposed a lot of Canada's shortcomings in its defense posture. We've been lucky that essentially geographically we are surrounded by three oceans and the world's preeminent military superpower. And for decades across multiple governments, defense has not been a priority. And you're seeing it now in terms of how just having a forward operating force of 700 people in Latvia as part of our NATO commitments has essentially exhausted our capabilities. There's reports coming out of soldiers having to purchase their own helmets. They're being equipped with World War II era pistols. Our commitment to supply tanks to Ukraine, I believe we gave just 2 to 4 tanks to Ukraine when they're asking for hundreds across NATO. It's really exposed where Canada has had the luxury of being able to ignore defense over the last several decades. And it's now coming to roost that, in an era where geography doesn't matter so much, and those safety barriers are being stripped away in terms of thawing Arctic, hyper-connected global economy, and information systems, which mean that disinformation, foreign interference, as we're seeing right now, has become a main thing.
Right.
So geographical distance is no longer keeping Canada safe as it did in the past,
Right.
and I think a lot of people around the country are waking up to that.
Sure.
In April, after the Washington Post report
I'm
broke,
going to cut you off there. I'm afraid to do
Yep.
this to you, but we do have to go to a break. But hold on to that thought. We'll get right back to you. Please stay with us.
Sure thing.